The search for answers. New questions about the breakup of the shuttle. In the sprawling debris field, more pieces of Columbia are recovered. Heightened scrutiny of the Columbia mission's troubled start. And why they fly. Astronauts explain the appeal of space.
This is the CBS Evening News with Dan Rather reporting from CBS News headquarters in New York.
Good evening. The search for clues to the cause of the Columbia disaster is underway in every sense tonight. At the highest levels, the official investigating commission is taking shape. While on the ground, searchers have already found wreckage in 23 counties and parishes of Texas and Louisiana, part of a debris field that stretches from the Dallas-Fort Worth area to New Orleans. CBS News coverage begins in Nacogdoches, Texas, with correspondent Bob McNamara, who has late word on the Columbia crew's fate. Bob?
Dan, tonight NASA says it has found some of the remains of all of the 7 astronauts, and CBS News has confirmed that a sizable piece of the shuttle's front fuselage has also been found, possibly part of the crew cabin. Major developments in a long day of searching. In the brushy East Texas backcountry, volunteers on ATVs and horseback joined the massive search to track down scattered shuttle debris and the remains of the 7 crew.
There's debris that, we may have to rely on hunters or wildlife enthusiasts to help us uncover, and it may be weeks or months down the road before that happens.
From pebble-sized pieces to the charred evidence of a horrific fire in the sky, the hardware and even the headgear of NASA cover a debris field over hundreds of square miles that technicians map with global positioning.
I believe we had around 1,500 locations mapped, which is just the tip of the iceberg.
Some of the wreckage rained down on schools, and officials rushed to mark it before students return Monday.
If it's deemed safe, then we'll have school and keep them inside if the stuff's not picked up by tomorrow.
Black Hawk helicopters scanned the Toledo Bend Reservoir area on the Texas-Louisiana border, where a section of shuttle debris described as the size of a compact car is submerged.
Sonar equipment there was used. Anyway, it did reveal there something large that was down there.
It could be days before much of the wreckage is removed and taken to a hangar at Louisiana's Barksdale Air Force Base for analysis. Souvenir hunters are warned to stay away.
Please do not commandeer any parts of the shuttle.
People who have found debris could face more than arrest for taking it.
If they touch the wrong component, they could become seriously ill or possibly even die from it.
More than 50 people have gone to local hospitals after touching the debris, but so far there have been no injuries. Dan?
Bob McNamara in Nacogdoches, Texas. NASA today named retired Navy Admiral Harold Gaiman to head an independent commission investigating the tragedy. The admiral helped investigate the terrorist attack on the USS Cole. CBS News aviation correspondent Bob Orr has the latest on the still young investigation.
Investigators now know Shuttle Columbia was in trouble as it crossed the California coast, 7 minutes before it disintegrated in the Texas skies. Sensors monitored by Mission Control show cascading failures on the left side of the shuttle, a loss of data from the wheel well, increased drag, and rising temperatures in the fuselage.
I'm talking about a temperature on the side of the vehicle, the left-hand side of the vehicle above the wing. Unusual temperature rise. The temperature rose 60 degrees over 5 minutes.
More than a dozen sensors, most of them in the left wing, used to measure temperatures, hydraulics, and tire pressure, were lost one after another, a sequential failure consistent with a catastrophic breakup. But NASA officials caution they've reached no conclusions.
At this stage, we're making sure that we don't take any pet theory or any one approach in favoring of one or another. We're making sure we look at every possible piece of evidence, every possible element of what could have gone wrong.
One thing certainly did go wrong during Columbia's January 16th launch. As the shuttle lifted off, something, foam insulation or perhaps even a chunk of ice, broke off the external fuel tank and struck the left wing. This still image, published today on the Florida Today website, seems to show the debris striking the bottom panel of the wing. Shuttle engineers at the time saw no real danger in continuing the mission, But now investigators want to know if the debris critically damaged the heat tiles needed to protect the shuttle during its fiery re-entry.
If there had been a compromise in that heat shield protection system and that heat actually got into the subsurface underneath those tiles, that would lead to a bad day pretty quickly. Whether or not the debris that was seen after launch contributed to that is not yet known.
The indications of possible problems in the wheel well and heat in the fuselage and along the left wing could all be, and emphasize could all be, consistent with the loss of thermal tiles and the subsequent breakup. But NASA says it still cannot rule out other possibilities like the structural failure of a door or a flight control surface. Dan?
Bob Orr, thanks. There was no reason to think that Columbia's return to Kennedy Space Center wouldn't be routine in every way. No reason until shortly before 9 in the morning Eastern Time yesterday. Randall Pinkston has the timeline of tragedy.
Columbia, Houston, good burn.
At 8:15 a.m. Eastern Time, Columbia's descent began over the Indian Ocean. Everything seemed fine as it crossed the Pacific, entering airspace over the California coastline at 8:51 just north of San Francisco. It was on track for a touchdown 25 minutes later at Kennedy Space Center. Then at 8:53, the first sign of trouble, the sudden loss of data from the hydraulic system, critical information indicating the position of flaps on Columbia's left wing. 3 minutes later, another data disruption to sensors in the brake lines and tires in the landing gear. 2 minutes later, at 8:58, yet another data dropout from sensors that monitor protective thermal tiles. Then at 8:59, another problem with data indicating landing gear pressure on the left side tires. Until that moment, Mission Control could talk to the astronauts, alerting them about the data problems, and Columbia's crew responded.
And Columbia, Houston, we see your tire pressure messages, and we did not copy your last.
Roger. The next sound was silence. All data transmission stopped as Columbia broke up and fell from the heavens. Its final mission ended after 15 days, 22 hours, 20 minutes, and 22 seconds. Randall Pinkston, CBS News, New York.
President Bush will attend a memorial service now set for Tuesday at Houston's Johnson Space Center, home to some 15,000 federal and private workers. CBS's John Blackstone tells us that in the communities where they live, the space program is a way of life.
As the nation mourns the loss of 7 astronauts, people in Houston are mourning the loss of 7 neighbors. The suburbs around the Johnson Space Center have been the home of astronauts since the space program began. Jeffrey Williams flew on Space Shuttle Atlantis.
There's nobody in the area that's not affected in some way.
The space program becomes personal when astronauts live just down the block.
You see them out mowing their yard. You see them at the grocery store.
This is really a company town in a way, I suppose. So something like this touches everyone here.
We're very close. And I think at this time is when we all do come together and hold each other up and put our arms around each other.
So tight-knit that at Grace Community Church, Reverend Steve Riggle lost 2 parishioners on Columbia.
2 members of one church on that craft.
Incredible. Unbelievable.
Both Columbia's commander, Rick Husband, and mission specialist Mike Anderson worshipped at Grace.
That's the amazing thing, that in this congregation, they're just normal people.
Rick Husband sang in the choir and often spoke to young people in the church, among them 14-year-old Shelley Bradley.
When they, at the end, said there were no survivors, I was just heartbroken.
But the tragedy hasn't changed the ambition of a girl who's grown up among space travelers.
You thought of being an astronaut?
Still do.
Still think of being an astronaut?
Mm-hmm.
Even as it copes with loss, this company town is also a place determined that the manned space program will go on. John Blackstone, CBS News at the Johnson Space Center.
In Washington today, some tough questions were being raised over the Shuttle Columbia disaster. White House correspondent John Roberts tracks the growing debate over money, memos, and safety.
President Bush attended church this morning amid questions on both the shuttle program's future and whether budgetary belt-tightening might have contributed to the disaster. Florida Senator Bill Nelson, who flew aboard Columbia in 1986, has been critical of cuts that have delayed safety upgrades for the shuttle.
They have been starving the NASA budget and delaying the safety upgrades that sooner or later is going to catch up with us.
NASA's overall budget has been pared by 40% over the last decade. Funding for the shuttle this year was cut $64 million from 2002. Last April, the former chair of the Aerospace Safety Advisory Panel told Congress, "I have never been as concerned for space shuttle safety as I am right now." NASA officials insist that safety is their primary concern, and many members of Congress believe that's true.
There is absolutely no evidence that I have heard to date that safety has been compromised at all by the amount of money that's been spent.
But Don Nelson, a retired NASA engineer who helped design the shuttle, bitterly disagrees. He claims NASA failed to respond to repeated signs that an aging shuttle fleet was heading for another disaster. Last August, he wrote President Bush, urging him to place a safety moratorium on shuttle flights, saying, "Your intervention is required to prevent another catastrophic space shuttle accident."
You got to realize this is a very risky business, and there has never been a launch vehicle that has gone more than 100 flights before we've had a catastrophe failure in it.
No one can yet say if this was the result of a lingering safety issue or just a bolt out of the blue that nothing could have prevented. President Bush will propose a 3% increase in NASA funding when he unveils his 2004 budget tomorrow. Congressional leaders have promised that if this was related to safety and a lack of funding, it will be addressed, and addressed aggressively. Dan?
John Roberts reporting live from the White House. Still to come on tonight's CBS Evening News, the Shuttle Columbia's history of troubles. And later, what does it take to be an astronaut? Columbia was the senior citizen, the oldest of America's aging shuttle fleet, and had logged more time in space than any other. One of the trouble spots investigators are looking at is the shuttle's heat tiles, an area that plagued Columbia from the beginning, as Tony Gaida reports.
What looks like a shooting star in the night sky over Southern California is actually Shuttle Columbia streaking toward home. These pictures of Columbia's final minutes may show the orbiter already breaking up. Flashes of light and red spots. A Caltech astronomer watching re-entry saw something bright fall off. He told CBS News he believed it was a tile from the shuttle's critical heat shield. If it was, Columbia's end would be a tragic mirror of its beginning. 22 years ago, when Columbia was 3 years behind schedule for its first launch, CBS News broadcast a report on the shuttle's persistent problems. It highlighted flaws in the heat shield tiles. They weren't sticking to the shuttle's skin, and many were defective. It took months and millions of dollars, but NASA fixed the problem.
But in the 112 flights leading into Columbia's mission, the heat shield tile have really worked very well indeed.
But that's not to say the tiles are not fragile. So fragile, the shuttle can't be flown in the rain. So fragile, the tiles can't absorb heavy impact. There were some 25,000 tiles on Shuttle Columbia, 10,000 of them considered extremely critical to the mission's safety. Ed Crawley is head of aeronautics and astronautics at MIT. He has meticulously reconstructed Columbia's final minutes.
It starts to point more and more like a failure at the tiles.
Crawley emphasizes nothing is certain yet, and neither he nor anyone else is ready to make a connection between an incident on Columbia's takeoff, when some debris slightly damaged the orbiter's left wing, and the shuttle's ultimate failure. But if that connection should prove true, knowing it would not have helped the astronauts.
They don't have any ability to float down to a wing and repair heat shield tiles, so that even if you knew there was a problem there, there's no known way the astronauts could have fixed it.
In other words, they may have been doomed from the start. Tony Gaida, CBS News, New York.
Just ahead on tonight's CBS Evening News, the nation pauses to mourn and remember. Americans of many faiths shared a burden of loss as they gathered today in their places of worship across the country. Bill Whitaker reports they prayed for the astronauts who never made it home and for the nation itself that now mourns them.
So close to home and yet so far, they did not make it all the way in.
Yet another of those galvanizing moments, Americans united in states of grief. In the Cathedral of Los Angeles, 7 candles for 7 souls. At the Israeli consulate in New York, condolences from one country in pain to another. Americans paid respect in ways as varied as the Crew of Seven, an Indian consulate gathering in Houston, at the church in Racine, Wisconsin, where astronaut Laurel Clark was wed. She's her brother's hero.
She was my big sister. I grew up with her. Heroes to me are something, way up there.
Gary and Liz Hunsikers saw the brilliant starburst yesterday from their Plano, Texas patio. But what they thought were chase planes, they later learned was flaming wreckage.
To hear the news and then to realize that all of our jubilation and excitement for thinking they were taking a safe trip home was actually watching 7 lives be lost. Hard to take.
Hard to take, a common sentiment today.
Rodeo program!
At the country's oldest stock show in Fort Worth, Texas, the cattle and the hats are big, and so is the hurt.
You hear the economy, you hear Iraq, then you hear the space shuttle. What's next?
At times like this, it might seem grief is the tie that binds, but people here will tell you the real glue is strength and resilience.
The same as a firefighter or someone else like that. I mean, he dies, but we don't stop. We continue on, and that's just, I think that's the American spirit. It really is. I mean, regardless of what happens, you take it and you roll with the punches.
And even when the punches are coming hard and fast, the sense here is we're still riding tall. Bill Whitaker, CBS News, Fort Worth, Texas.
Straight ahead on the CBS Evening News, the dream and the glory of space and its irresistible allure. Much as we admire the courage and dedication of the nation's astronauts, we can find ourselves wondering at a time like this, what leads them to put their lives on the line out there, up there, on the far frontier. Lee Cowan looked for some answers from 2 men who have been there.
Manned spaceflight has become perhaps the greatest understatement of our time. We've gotten so used to the heart-stopping roar of a liftoff, the breathtaking views, and we've even grown accustomed to the notion that our footprints remain on a world beyond ours, and that those who go nearly always return. And yet there isn't a school child, a teacher, a musician, or a priest who hasn't looked up and wished they could go too. And why not?
Low Earth orbit, looking at the Earth, was the most beautiful thing I ever saw. It was gorgeous. You get a sunrise or a sunset every 45 minutes.
You look out the overhead window, and the fury and fire behind you is just unbelievable.
William Fisher and Rich Clifford are just as unbelievable. Both flew shuttle missions. Clifford flew 3.
There's got to be some trepidation, especially on your first flight, not really knowing what it's going to be like up there.
Trepidation is probably the wrong word. It's more anticipation of something you've been wanting to do for your whole life.
Houston Discovery, roll program.
The gauges are spinning like wild. Everybody's shaking. You've seen the photos of that. And yeah, you're just glad that the computers are controlling it.
But computers can't control enthusiasm.
We stood up we were supposed to sit down, but we stood up and looked out the overhead window as we entered. And
you're going at Mach 16, 17, 18, and you're standing up?
Yeah, I can tell that now. I think the statute of limitations is over because we were supposed to be sitting down, but it was just too much fun.
And whether it's the victorious, like John Glenn's return to space, or the miraculous, like Apollo 13's return home, or the tragic beyond words, the only thing stronger than the lure of space is the admiration of those who go there.
I'd go to the moon if they'd go there.
Without hesitation?
If they'd let me back in, I'd jump on it.
There is a price to courting the extraordinary. The right stuff isn't always the safest, but it is some of the most courageous and most envious stuff of all. Lee Cowan, CBS News, at the Johnson Space Center.
And that's part of our World and Beyond tonight. There'll be more about the Shuttle Columbia coming up quickly on 60 Minutes and again first thing tomorrow on The Early Show. And we'll have a complete wrap-up on tomorrow's CBS Evening News. Until then, Dan Rather reporting from CBS News World Headquarters in New York. Good night.
For news 24 hours a day, go to cbsnews.com, AOL keyword CBS News. The tragic events of 9/11, the months of painful recovery, the war on terror, escalating violence in the Middle East, tough economic times, and corporate scandal. Getting the story and getting it right takes experience. Experience you can trust. The CBS Evening News with Dan Rather. Experience CBS News.